A millionaire hired a humble maid to clean his mansion, but when he came home early one day, he was shocked to find what she was doing with his 7-year-old son. The scene he witnessed would change their lives forever. Where are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button if you want to see how this heartwarming story unfolds. This is one transformation you won't want to miss. Griffin Hayes stood at the window of his study, gazing out at the 15 acres of manicured grounds that surrounded his Georgian-inspired mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The property was worth millions, but to Griffin it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. 4 years had passed since Celeste's death during childbirth, yet her absence lingered in every corner, in every shadow. He adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his platinum watch, a nervous habit that had intensified since becoming a single father. The new cleaning lady was due to arrive in 5 minutes. Normally, Mrs. Whitfield, his stern housekeeper, handled staff matters, but Griffin had decided to personally approve this hire. The last 3 cleaners had quit within months, citing the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. "Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Whitfield's crisp voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ms. Thorne has arrived for her first day." Griffin turned his expression impassive. "Send her in." Meredith Thorne entered the study, her posture straight, despite her obvious nervousness. She wore simple black slacks and a modest blue blouse, clean but clearly well worn. Griffin noted the calluses on her hands, the determined set of her jaw, and the gentle intelligence in her eyes. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice warm but professional. "I understand the position requires discretion and thoroughness." Griffin nodded, studying her resume once more. "I see you've worked for several families in New Haven." "Yes, sir. I've been a domestic worker for 8 years now." "And your son?" Griffin asked, glancing at the mention of a child on her application. A soft smile transformed Meredith's face. "Dashiell is 7. He stays with my mother while I work." Griffin flinched internally at the age, the same as his son Jasper. For a brief moment he wondered if hiring a mother of a boy Jasper's age was wise, but he pushed the thought aside. "Mrs. Whitfield will show you your duties," he said dismissively. "The East Wing requires particular attention. It's been neglected." As Meredith turned to leave, the study door creaked open slightly. A small, solemn face peered through the gap, dark hair falling across serious eyes that were startlingly similar to Celeste's. "Jasper," Griffin said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "This is Ms. Thorne. She'll be cleaning the house." The boy said nothing, merely observing with the quiet intensity that always unsettled Griffin. It was as if his son could see straight through him, past the successful CEO facade to the broken man beneath. Meredith knelt down, meeting Jasper at eye level. "Hello, Jasper. It's very nice to meet you. You have a beautiful home." Jasper's eyes widened slightly at being addressed directly. Most staff treated him like fine china, present but untouchable. "Do you like paper airplanes?" she asked, her voice conversational rather than condescending. A tiny nod. "Me too. My son Dashiell can make one that does loops. Maybe I can show you sometime." For an instant, interest flickered across Jasper's features before he retreated back into his shell, disappearing from the doorway without a word. Griffin had watched the interaction with a strange tightness in his chest. He hadn't seen Jasper express interest in anything for months. "Miss Thorne," he said, as she rose to leave. "The East Wing. That's my late wife's greenhouse and studio. It needs careful handling." Meredith nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "I'll treat it with respect, Mr. Hayes." As she left with Mrs. Whitfield, Griffin returned to the window, watching the gardeners trim the perfect hedges that surrounded his perfect, lifeless home. Something about the new cleaner unsettled him, a warmth that seemed out of place in the cold elegance of the Hayes estate. Little did he know that the simple hiring of a cleaning lady would break down the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart and his son's. Meredith's feet ached as she unlocked the door to her modest 2-bedroom apartment in the working-class neighborhood of New Haven. The 40-minute commute from Greenwich had stretched to over an hour due to traffic, and exhaustion settled deep in her bones. Still, when she heard the excited footsteps racing toward her, a genuine smile replaced her weariness. "Mom, did you see the mansion? Was it like the ones on TV? Did they have a pool?" Dashiell's questions tumbled out as he wrapped his arms around her waist. Meredith laughed, running her fingers through her son's unruly brown curls. Yes, to all three, little man, and they have 15 acres of land with gardens that look like something from a fairy tale. Her mother, Eleanor, appeared from the tiny kitchen, the smell of pot roast trailing behind her. How was the first day with the millionaire? Billionaire, actually, Meredith corrected, setting down her purse and kicking off her practical work shoes. And it was interesting. The house is beautiful but feels empty, like a museum where people aren't allowed to touch anything. And the boy? Eleanor asked, her voice softening. She had been watching Dashiell since he was a baby, supporting Meredith after Ryan had abandoned them before their son was even born. Meredith's expression turned thoughtful. Jasper. He's Dash's age, but completely different. So quiet and sad. He looks at everything like he's afraid to hope for anything good. Dashiell pulled at her sleeve. Can I meet him sometime? Maybe we could play Cosmic Explorers together. We'll see, honey. Now go wash up for dinner. As Dashiell raced off, Eleanor studied her daughter. You're not just a cleaner to them, Mary. Remember that. People like the Hayeses have different rules. Meredith nodded, though her thoughts drifted to the solemn little boy and his distant father. The tuition payment for Dashiell's school is due next month. This job pays twice what I was making before. I need to make it work. Just be careful, Eleanor warned. Rich men don't see women like us as equals. I know, Mom. Meredith began setting the table, the familiar routine comforting after a day in such alien surroundings. But there's something about that house. It's like it's holding its breath, waiting for someone to make it come alive again. Across the county, Griffin sat alone in his vast dining room, the ceiling soaring 20 feet above him. Jasper had eaten earlier with his nanny, as was their routine. The boys' schedule, managed by Mrs. Whitfield and occasionally by Delaney Foster, Celeste's cousin, was designed for maximum educational advantage. Piano lessons, French tutor, advanced mathematics. At 7, Jasper had the schedule of a prep school teenager. Griffin cut precisely into his steak prepared by their private chef. The silence pressed in around him, interrupted only by the occasional ping of work emails arriving on his phone. Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Whitfield appeared at his elbow. Ms. Foster called. She'll be returning from Manhattan tomorrow and wishes to discuss Jasper's summer activities. Griffin suppressed a sigh. Delaney had appointed herself Jasper's guardian, in all but legal terms, after Celeste's death. As his wife's cousin and Jasper's godmother, she had stepped in when Griffin had been too consumed by grief to function. He owed her for that, but her increasing involvement sometimes felt suffocating. Fine. Tell her I'll be available after my meeting with the Singapore investors. As Mrs. Whitfield left, Griffin noticed a small paper airplane on the sidebar. He picked it up, examining the precise folds. Had the new cleaner made this? Had Jasper? On impulse, he launched it across the room. The plane soared in a graceful arc, before nosediving into his water glass. For the first time in months, Griffin Hayes felt the corners of his mouth turn upward in what might almost be called a smile. Upstairs, Jasper sat by his window, watching the stars appear one by one in the evening sky. In his hand, he clutched a paper airplane, one made with colorful paper that the new cleaning lady had slipped him before leaving. She had shown him how to fold it properly, her hands gentle as they guided his smaller ones through the creases. "If you throw it just right," she had whispered, "it can fly all the way to the moon." Jasper didn't believe that, of course. He was too smart, too logical, just like his father always told him to be. But something about the way Ms. Thorne had smiled at him made him want to try anyway. He launched the plane toward the night sky, watching as it glided across his room before settling on the plush carpet. Not quite to the moon, but farther than he'd ever managed before. The Tiffany vase had stood in the formal living room for 3 generations of the Hayes family. Its delicate blue glass, handcrafted in 1890, captured light like a trapped ocean wave. It was one of Celeste's favorite pieces, prominently displayed, despite Griffin's preference for more modern aesthetics. It now lay shattered on the Italian marble floor, fractured into dozens of glittering shards. Jasper stood frozen beside the destruction, his small face drained of color. He had only wanted to look at the flower pattern up close to see if it matched. The illustrations in his mother's botanical journals that his father kept locked away. Now the irreplaceable heirloom was destroyed, and the heavy footsteps approaching from the hallway signaled his father's imminent arrival. What was that noise? Griffin's voice preceded him into the room. When he saw the scene, the broken vase, his terrified son, his expression hardened. Jasper, what happened? The boy's voice was barely audible. I was looking at it. I just wanted to see. That vase was over 100 years old. Griffin interrupted, his tone controlled but ice-cold. Your mother treasured it. Jasper's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to. Of course you didn't mean to, Griffin snapped, running a hand through his perfectly groomed hair. But this is why we don't touch things that don't belong to us. This is why we have rules. Meredith had heard the crash from the library she'd been dusting. She now stood in the doorway, taking in the situation with a quick glance. The broken vase, the trembling child, the father, whose grief had calcified into rigid control. Mr. Hayes, she said quietly, stepping into the room, I believe the accident was my fault. Both Hayes men turned to her in surprise. I moved the vase while dusting earlier, she continued smoothly. I must not have placed it securely back on its stand. Griffin's eyes narrowed. Ms. Thorne, that vase has stood safely in that spot for decades. Nevertheless, Meredith maintained, meeting his gaze steadily, I take responsibility. I'll deduct the cost from my wages, of course. A humorless laugh escaped Griffin. The vase is worth more than you'd make in 5 years. Then I suppose I'll be working here for quite some time, Meredith replied, her chin lifting slightly. Something shifted in Griffin's expression, a flicker of respect perhaps, or simple disbelief at her audacity. Jasper looked between them, confusion replacing his fear. No one had ever stepped between him and his father's disappointment before. No one will be paying for the vase, Griffin finally said. Accidents happen, but in the future, Jasper, remember that some things once broken can never be repaired. The weight behind his words suggested he wasn't just talking about the Tiffany glass. As Griffin left the room, Meredith knelt beside Jasper, carefully beginning to gather the larger pieces of glass. You didn't have to do that, the boy whispered, his voice small but steady. It really was my fault. Meredith glanced toward the doorway to ensure Griffin was gone before responding. Everyone deserves a second chance, Jasper. Besides, sometimes the most beautiful things come from broken pieces. She smiled softly. Did you know that in Japan they repair broken pottery with gold? The cracks become the most special part. Really? For the first time, Jasper's eyes lit with genuine curiosity. Really, it's called kintsugi. Maybe we could look it up in the library sometime. She winked conspiratorially. Now, why don't you run along while I clean this up? No bare feet in this room for a while, okay? As Jasper carefully walked away, he paused at the doorway. Thank you, Miss Thorne. He said the words sounding practiced, as if gratitude was a foreign language he was still learning. Later that evening, when Meredith was preparing to leave, she found a small drawing slipped under the windshield wiper of her aged Honda. A child's rendering of a vase, the cracks filled with golden marker. In the corner, in careful printing, from Jasper. She tucked it into her purse, unaware that Griffin had watched the exchange from his office window, his expression unreadable in the fading light. 3 weeks into her employment, Meredith had established an unspoken routine with Jasper. While cleaning the library, always at 4 o'clock when his French tutor left and before his piano lesson, she would leave small treasures for him to woo, discover origami animals, interesting stones from the garden, or facts about space written on colorful paper. In return, Jasper would leave her drawings or occasionally hesitant questions written in his neat script. Do you think stars feel lonely? Or, why do people say broke my heart when hearts can't really break? They never acknowledged this exchange when others were present. It was their secret communication, a language of curiosity and wonder, in a house where such things seemed out of place. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Meredith was polishing the grand piano in the music room when she heard a muffled sob from the window seat. Jasper sat huddled against the glass, tears streaming silently down his face as he watched the rain. Jasper, she approached cautiously. What's wrong, sweetheart? He quickly wiped his eyes. Nothing, I'm fine. Meredith sat beside him, careful to maintain a respectful distance. You know, my Dashiell says I'm fine is secret kid code for I'm really not fine at all. A ghost of a smile touched Jasper's lips before fading. Today is supposed to be my star-watching night. Dad promised we'd use the telescope. Ah, Meredith nodded. And now it's raining. He probably wouldn't have come anyway, Jasper whispered, the admission seeming to cost him greatly. He always has meetings or calls or something important. The raw hurt in his voice struck Meredith like a physical blow. Before she could respond, the door opened, and Mrs. Whitfield appeared, her perpetually disapproving expression deepening at the sight of the cleaner sitting with the young master. Ms. Thorne, the silver in the dining room requires your attention, she said pointedly. Jasper, your piano instructor, will arrive in 15 minutes. You should prepare. Jasper's face immediately closed off, returning to the polite mask he typically wore. He slid from the window seat and headed for the door without another word. Meredith rose to follow, but as she passed Mrs. Whitfield, the older woman gripped her arm. Remember your place, the housekeeper warned in a low voice. You're here to clean, not to counsel. With all due respect, Mrs. Whitfield, Meredith replied, quietly. Sometimes what needs cleaning most isn't visible to the naked eye. The housekeeper's lips thinned. Mr. Hayes has very specific ideas about his son's upbringing. Emotional indulgence isn't part of the curriculum. And how's that working out? Meredith challenged, then immediately regretted her boldness. She needed this job. To her surprise, something like sadness flickered across Mrs. Whitfield's stern features. It's not my place to say, Miss Thorne, nor is it yours. Later that evening, after most of the household had retired, Meredith found herself drawn back to the music room. Rain still pattered against the windows, casting dancing shadows across the gleaming piano. On impulse, she began to construct something from the sheet music paper in the cabinet, a telescope made of rolled paper decorated with silver stars, drawn with a marker from her purse. What are you doing? She startled at Griffin's voice. He stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, looking exhausted after what she assumed had been another late conference call. Meredith hesitated, then decided on honesty. Jasper was disappointed about missing the stars tonight. I thought this might help even if it's not real. Griffin approached, examining her creation. That's not how a reflector telescope works, he said, but his tone lacked its usual sharpness. The eyepiece should be on the side, not the end. Meredith smiled, unexpectedly charmed by his literal interpretation. I stand corrected. Would you like to help me fix it? The question clearly caught him off guard. For a moment, the powerful CEO looked almost boyishly uncertain. I should return to my emails, he said finally. Of course. Meredith set down the paper telescope, though I imagine they'll still be there in the morning. Griffin paused at the door. Jasper told you about our plans. He mentioned your star-watching night. She hesitated, then added gently, he was looking forward to it. Something complicated passed across Griffin's features, regret perhaps, or annoyance at her implied criticism. The meteorological forecast indicated precipitation was likely. I should have cancelled earlier. Meredith bit back a smile at his formal phrasing. You know, Mr. Hayes, sometimes the clouds make their own constellations. You just have to know how to look. He regarded her with an unreadable expression. Is that what you tell your son when plans fall through? Sometimes, she acknowledged. Other times I just admit I messed up and promise to do better next time. Griffin's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a small figure appeared in the doorway behind him. Dad. Jasper stood in his blue pajamas, a book clutched to his chest. I can't sleep. The tension in Griffin's shoulders visibly increased. Meredith recognized his expression, the look of a man who excelled in boardrooms, but felt utterly out of his depth with a child's emotional needs. Perhaps a story would help, Meredith suggested softly, moving toward the door. I'll leave you. No, Griffin interrupted, his voice oddly strained. Perhaps you could assist. I have a call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. The request, admission of inadequacy from such a proudly self-sufficient man, surprised her. But the hopeful look that flashed across Jasper's face made it impossible to refuse. I'd be happy to, she said. I happen to be an expert in bedtime stories." As she followed Jasper upstairs, she felt Griffin's gaze on her back, measuring, evaluating, perhaps wondering what he had just set in motion by allowing this boundary to be crossed. Neither of them could have predicted how that simple paper telescope would change the trajectory of all their lives. Griffin Hayes had built his software empire on attention to detail. He noticed patterns others missed, anticipated market shifts before they occurred, and never, absolutely never, acted on impulse, which was why he found himself utterly perplexed by the words that had just left his mouth. "You should bring your son to visit sometime," he said to Meredith as she dusted the bookshelves in his home office. Jasper might benefit from the interaction. Meredith froze feather duster suspended in midair. "I'm sorry." Griffin cleared his throat, already regretting the suggestion. It was merely a thought. Jasper's therapist believes peer socialization would be beneficial. That much was true. Dr. Abernathy had expressed concern about Jasper's isolation during their last session. What Griffin failed to mention was that he had dismissed the suggestion of playdates with his business associates' children, artificial social constructs engineered by ambitious parents seeking connections. But something about Meredith's stories of her son, his creativity, his enthusiasm for space and science, had resonated. Perhaps because they reminded Griffin of himself, before ambition and grief had calcified his heart. Meredith set down the duster, studying him with those direct, intelligent eyes that always made him feel strangely exposed. "Are you certain, Mr. Hayes, I wouldn't want to overstep?" "It's a professional recommendation," he clarified stiffly. "Nothing more." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Of course. Would this Saturday be convenient?" Dashiell has been curious about the mansion ever since I described the library. Griffin nodded, already mentally rearranging his schedule. Saturday would be acceptable. Jasper has piano at 9, but afterward would work. "Then it's a playdate," Meredith said, the warmth in her voice softening the formality of their exchange. As she returned to her dusting, Griffin found himself wondering what he had just initiated, and why the prospect filled him with such unexpected anticipation. Saturday arrived with perfect Connecticut spring weather, sunshine warming the estates, gardens where the first tulips were beginning to bloom. Meredith arrived with Dashiell, who gazed wide-eyed at the mansion's soaring facade. "Whoa," he breathed, clutching his mother's hand. "It looks like a castle." Meredith smoothed his unruly curls, a nervous habit. "Remember what we talked about. Inside voice, no running, and be respectful of other people's things," Dashiell finished. "I know, Mom." Jasper waited in the grand foyer, standing unnaturally still, in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look like a miniature businessman. Griffin hovered nearby, equally formal in weekend casual attire that still somehow managed to look boardroom-ready. The contrast between the two boys couldn't have been more striking. Dashiell, vibrant in worn jeans and a faded NASA t-shirt, practically bounced with energy. Jasper, contained and watchful, offered a practiced handshake that Dashiell bypassed entirely in favor of an enthusiastic wave. "Hi, you must be Jasper. Mom says you have the biggest library ever and that you're really smart. Do you like cosmics? Explorers, I brought my collection cards if you want to see them." Jasper blinked, obviously overwhelmed by this torrent of words. He glanced at his father, seeking guidance. Griffin, looking equally out of his depth, cleared his throat. "Perhaps you could show Dashiell the game room, Jasper." A hesitant nod. "Yes, sir." Meredith gently nudged her son forward. "Go ahead, Dash. And remember, I know, no breaking priceless artifacts," Dashiell said with an exaggerated eye roll that made Jasper's eyes widen in shock. No one rolled their eyes at adults in the Hayes household. As the boys headed toward the East Wing, Dashiell already chattering about constellations, Griffin turned to Meredith with an expression that mixed amusement and concern. "Is he always so energetic, talkative, enthusiastic?" Meredith supplied, with a laugh. "Yes, always. I hope it's not too much for Jasper." Griffin watched as his son hesitantly responded to something Dashiell said, his posture already less rigid. "Actually, I think it might be exactly what he needs." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two adults suddenly without their usual roles to define their interaction. "Would you like coffee?" Griffin finally offered. "I believe Mrs. Whitfield prepared some before leaving for her sisters." "That would be nice," Meredith agreed, following him to the kitchen, a room she usually only entered to clean. As Griffin prepared 2 cups movements precise as a laboratory technician, Meredith observed him with newfound curiosity. Outside the employer-employee dynamic, she could see the uncertainty beneath his controlled exterior. "You know," she said conversationally, "Dashiell's father left before he was born." Griffin glanced up, surprised by the personal revelation. "I'm sorry to hear that," Meredith shrugged. "I'm not anymore. But it means Dash never had a male role model. My brother tries, but he's in Seattle." She accepted the coffee with a smile of thanks. "I guess what I'm saying is, this means a lot. The invitation." Griffin seemed momentarily at a loss for words unused to such straightforward sincerity. "It's good for Jasper," he finally said, retreating to safer ground. A crash from upstairs interrupted their conversation, followed by boyish laughter, including a sound Griffin hadn't heard in years, Jasper giggling. "Should we check on them?" he asked, already moving toward the stairs. Meredith laid a gentle hand on his arm. "If nothing's on fire and no one's crying, I vote we let them be. Sometimes the best memories come from a little chaos." Griffin stared at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face, open, genuine, so different from the calculated expressions he encountered in his business world. Something shifted in his chest, a loosening of tightly held control. "Chaos it is then," he agreed, and was rewarded with Meredith's brightest smile yet. "Can we do it again next Saturday?" Jasper asked, his voice barely audible, as Griffin tucked him into bed that night. The question was so unexpected that Griffin momentarily froze. In the weeks following Dashiell's first visit, something had changed in the Hayes mansion. Jasper had begun asking questions at dinner, offering hesitant opinions about his lessons, even requesting modifications to his rigid schedule. Mrs. Whitfield had remarked with thinly disguised disapproval that the young master was becoming quite spirited. Griffin knew the source of this transformation. Meredith Thorne and her irrepressible son had breathed life into their mausoleum of a home. The boys had become inseparable on weekends, with Dashiell's visits now a regular occurrence. Even more surprising was how Griffin himself had been drawn into their orbit, finding himself involved in backyard science experiments, impromptu cookie baking sessions, and animated discussions about space exploration. "Dad," Jasper prompted, interrupting Griffin's thoughts. "About next Saturday." Griffin smoothed the Egyptian cotton sheets, an unnecessary gesture that gave him time to compose his thoughts. "Actually, I was thinking something different for next weekend." Jasper's face fell. "Oh, the meteor shower," Griffin continued. "The Perseids will be visible Saturday night. Perhaps Dashiell and Ms. Thorne might like to join us for a proper astronomical observation. We could set up the telescope on the south lawn." Jasper sat up, eyes wide. "Really like camping." The word camping had never entered Griffin's vocabulary, let alone his recreational plans, but the hope in his son's eyes made him nod. "I suppose we could set up tents, if that would enhance the experience," Jasper launched, himself forward, arms wrapping around Griffin's neck in a spontaneous hug that left him momentarily stunned. When was the last time his son had embraced him without prompting? "This will be the best night ever," Jasper whispered against his shoulder. Later, as Griffin sent the invitation via text message, another boundary crossed, sharing his personal number with an employee, he found himself unexpectedly nervous about Meredith's response. The 3 dots appeared immediately, followed by her reply. "Dashiell is literally jumping on his bed with excitement. We'd love to join you. I make excellent s'mores, an essential camping tradition." Griffin found himself smiling at his phone, a warm sensation expanding in his chest that he didn't dare examine too closely. The night of the meteor shower arrived with perfect conditions: clear skies, mild temperature, and a crescent moon that wouldn't outshine the celestial display. Griffin had outdone himself, setting up a professional astronomical telescope, 2 luxury camping tents, and a fire pit surrounded by comfortable outdoor furniture. "This is awesome," Dashiell exclaimed as he ran across the lawn, his excitement causing Jasper to break into uncharacteristic laughter. Meredith approached more slowly, taking in the elaborate setup. When you said camping, I pictured something a bit more rustic. Griffin adjusted the telescope's alignment. I believe in appropriate preparation. Clearly, she replied, amusement dancing in her eyes. I brought hot dogs and marshmallows, but I see you have a gourmet spread. Indeed, the outdoor table held an impressive array of artisanal cheeses, fresh fruit, and what appeared to be champagne, cooling in a silver bucket. The boys might prefer your contributions, Griffin admitted, watching as Jasper and Dashiell examined the telescope with fascination. I'm not well versed in typical camping cuisine. Well then, Mr. Hayes, Meredith said, setting down her simple grocery bag, prepare for a culinary education. The evening unfolded with unexpected ease. Under Meredith's guidance, they roasted hot dogs on sticks, constructed messy but delicious s'mores, and listened to Dashiell's enthusiastic retelling of space myths. As darkness fell completely, they gathered around the telescope, taking turns observing the heavens. Look, there's one, Jasper pointed excitedly as the first meteor streaked across the sky. Soon the celestial show was in full display. Brilliant. Trails of light crisscrossing the darkness. The four of them lay on blankets spread across the lawn necks, craned upward in wonder. Make a wish, Meredith whispered as a particularly bright meteor blazed overhead. Griffin turned his head slightly, observing her profile in the firelight, the gentle curve of her cheek, the wonder in her eyes as she gazed skyward. Something shifted inside him, a recognition that the walls he had built after Celeste's death were crumbling stone by stone. What did you wish for, Dad? Jasper asked, his small hand finding Griffin's in the darkness. Griffin squeezed his son's fingers, gently. If I tell you, it won't come true. But in the privacy of his thoughts, Griffin acknowledged what he had wished for: more nights like this, more moments where the weight of grief and responsibility lifted from his shoulders, more opportunities to see his son smile like he was now, uninhibited, joyful, alive. As the boys eventually drifted to sleep in their tent, Griffin and Meredith remained by the dying fire, a comfortable silence between them. Thank you, Griffin said finally, the words inadequate for what he wanted to express, for bringing this into our lives. Meredith studied him, firelight casting her features in soft gold. You know, for someone who created revolutionary software, you sometimes miss the most obvious solutions. And what solution is that? That happiness isn't programmed or scheduled, she said gently. It's allowed. Griffin looked away, her insight cutting too close to truths he wasn't ready to face. Jasper's mother was the one who understood such things. I've always been analytical. Tell me about her. Meredith said, the request so unexpected that Griffin found himself answering before he could retreat behind his usual reserve. Celeste was vibrant, an artist. She believed in possibilities where I saw only probabilities. He gestured toward the greenhouse visible at the edge of the property. She designed that space to teach Jasper about growth and transformation. She called it bottling sunshine for rainy days. Meredith smiled. She sounds wonderful. She was. Griffin stared into the embers. I couldn't save her. The admission, never voiced to anyone, hung in the night air between them. Meredith's hand found his warm and real. But you can honor her by helping Jasper live fully. I think that's what she would have wanted. Griffin didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, he turned his palm upward, their fingers interlacing under the canopy of stars. Neither of them noticed the silhouette watching from the upper window of the mansion, Delaney Foster, who had arrived unannounced from Manhattan, her expression hardening as she observed the intimate scene below. What exactly is going on here? Griffin! Delaney Foster's voice sliced through the peaceful breakfast atmosphere the following morning. She stood in the doorway of the sunroom, elegant in a tailored cream pantsuit, her blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon. Griffin looked up from where he sat with Jasper, reviewing the photographs they had taken of the meteor shower. Meredith and Dashiell had left early that morning, but their presence lingered in the relaxed set of Jasper's shoulders, the scattered remnants of their stargazing adventure. Delaney, I wasn't expecting you until next week. Griffin rose, kissing her cheek perfunctorily. Clearly. Her gaze swept over the table, the informal breakfast settings, the star charts, the childish drawings. Mrs. Whitfield informs me that you hosted some sort of camp out with the cleaning lady and her child. Jasper shrunk visibly at her tone, the animation draining from his face. Aunt Delaney, we saw 16 meteors and— Darling, adults are speaking, she interrupted smoothly. Why don't you go practice your scales before Mr. Abramowitz arrives? Griffin felt a flash of irritation at her dismissal of his son. Actually, Jasper has the morning free. We were planning to organize his astronomical observations. Delaney's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Free time. What about his French comprehension? It can wait, Griffin said firmly. Jasper, why don't you take your notebook to the library? I'll join you shortly. When the boy had left, Delaney rounded on Griffin. What's happening to you? First, I hear you've been letting the help bring her child around regularly. Now you're cancelling Jasper's lessons and sleeping outdoors like camping enthusiasts. She pronounced the words as if describing an unsavory cult. Griffin sighed, pouring her a cup of coffee as a peace offering. Jasper is thriving, Delaney. He's happier than I've seen him in years. Children need structure, not happiness, she countered, accepting the coffee but leaving it untouched. Celeste would have wanted him prepared for Whitmore Academy, not playing with some cleaning woman's offspring. The mention of Celeste sparked Griffin's temper. Don't presume to know what Celeste would have wanted. Delaney's expression softened into practiced concern. I'm worried about you, Griffin. About both of you. This woman is clearly overstepping her boundaries, using her son to create an emotional dependency. Meredith has done nothing inappropriate. Griffin defended, realizing too late that his use of her first name hadn't gone unnoticed. Meredith is it? Delaney's voice cooled several degrees. And does Meredith understand the difference between employment and integration into your personal life? Because from what Mrs. Whitfield describes, those lines are becoming dangerously blurred. Griffin turned away, gazing out at the gardens, where just hours before they had lain watching the stars. Jasper needs connection, Delaney. Dashiell provides that. And what does the mother provide for you, Griffin? The question hung between them, loaded with implication. That's enough, he said sharply. I appreciate your concern, but how I manage my household is my decision. Delaney set down her untouched coffee. As Jasper's godmother and Celeste's family, I have a responsibility to ensure her son is raised according to her wishes. This situation is inappropriate on multiple levels. You're setting yourself up for exploitation, not to mention confusing Jasper about his place in society. His place in society, Griffin echoed incredulously. He's 7 years old. And the heir to one of America's largest tech fortunes, Delaney reminded him. These early connections shape his future understanding of his responsibilities. Do you really want him believing that crossing class boundaries has no consequences? The word struck uncomfortably close to Griffin's own ingrained beliefs he had begun to question since Meredith entered their lives. Still, decades of social conditioning couldn't be dismissed so easily. I'll consider your concerns, he said finally, a diplomatic response that committed him to nothing. Delaney nodded, seemingly satisfied with this small victory. That's all I ask. Now I've brought the Whitmore Academy brochures. Their early admission process begins next month, and with your influence we could secure Jasper a place despite the waiting list. As she spread glossy pamphlets across the table, covering the star charts and breakfast dishes, Griffin felt a heaviness return to his shoulders, the weight of expectations, traditions, and the carefully ordered world he had almost allowed himself to escape. Later that day, when Meredith arrived for her regular cleaning shift, she immediately sensed the change. The house had reverted to its former atmosphere, formal, cold, controlled. Jasper was nowhere to be seen, sequestered with a tutor in the study. Mrs. Whitfield supervised Meredith's work with unusual attentiveness, never leaving her alone for more than a few minutes. It wasn't until late afternoon that Meredith encountered Griffin in the hallway outside his office. The easy companionship of the previous evening had vanished, replaced by his earlier professional distance. Mr. Hayes, she acknowledged, with a careful nod. I wanted to thank you again for last night. Dashiell hasn't stopped talking about the meteors. Griffin glanced toward his office door where Delaney's voice could be heard on the phone. Yes, well, it was an educational opportunity. The dismissive tone stung. "Is everything all right?" "Perfectly fine," he replied stiffly. "However, I should mention that Jasper's schedule will be intensifying in preparation for school evaluations. The weekend activities will need to be curtailed for the time being." Meredith felt the deliberate distancing, like a physical barrier being erected between them. "I see. And is that what Jasper wants?" A flash of something, regret conflict, crossed Griffin's features before his expression hardened. "What Jasper needs and what he wants are not always aligned, Miss Thorne. I would have thought you'd understand. That as a parent." Before she could respond, Delaney emerged from the office, her assessing gaze travelling over Meredith's simple work clothes. "Ah, there you are, Griffin. The Whitmore headmaster is expecting our call in 5 minutes. She smiled, coolly at Meredith. "Ah, you must be Miss Thorne. The East Wing chandeliers could use attention when you have a moment." The dismissal was unmistakable. Meredith nodded, professional mask firmly in place, despite the confusion and hurt swirling inside her. "Of course, Miss Foster, right away." As she walked away, she heard Delaney's voice deliberately pitched to carry, "Really, Griffin, there's no need to explain your parenting decisions to the staff." Meredith's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. Whatever had begun to grow, between them, friendship connection, possibly something more, was being systematically uprooted before it could take root. She paused at the window overlooking the garden, where they had watched the stars fall from the sky. Just yesterday she had believed those stars were aligning in their favor. Now she recognized the truth in Griffin Hayes's world. People like her would always be shooting stars, briefly bright, ultimately transient. Autumn came to Connecticut in a blaze of color. The Hayes estate grounds transformed into a canvas of crimson, amber, and gold that would have inspired Celeste's artistic eye. But inside the mansion, a different transformation had occurred. A reversion to the cold formality that had previously defined the household. In the 2 months since Delaney's return, Meredith had been systematically pushed to the margins of the Hayes family life. Her cleaning assignments kept her primarily in unused guest rooms and formal areas. Jasper's schedule had been packed with additional lessons and preparatory sessions for Whitmore Academy interviews. The weekend visits with Dashiell had ceased entirely. Meredith maintained her professional demeanor, though it pained her to see Jasper retreating back into his shell. The boy would sometimes leave small drawings or notes where only she would find them, under a vase or behind a curtain, silent. Messages that he hadn't forgotten their friendship. Griffin had become a ghost in his own home, frequently traveling for business or locked in his office when present. On the rare occasions they crossed paths, his interactions with Meredith were coldly polite, as if their stargazing night had never happened. November arrived, with an unseasonable warmth, golden afternoon light filtering through the library windows, as Meredith dusted the shelves. A small sound at the door made her turn to find Jasper watching her, his expression carefully neutral in case anyone was observing. "Hello, Jasper," she said warmly. "How are your studies going?" He shrugged, glancing down the hallway before entering. "Fine. Mr. Abramowitz says my French accent is improving." "That's wonderful." She continued her dusting, allowing him the space to speak if he wished. After a moment he approached, fidgeting with the edge of his sweater. "Miss Thorne, is Dashiell mad at me?" The question caught her off guard. "Of course not, sweetheart." "Why would you think that?" "Because we don't play anymore." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Aunt Delaney says it's better this way, that I need to focus on my future." Meredith carefully set down her duster, fighting the surge of anger at how adult concerns were being forced onto his small shoulders. "Dashiell misses you very much," she assured him. "He asks about you all the time. And for what it's worth, I think 7-year-olds should be allowed to be 7. A tiny smile flickered across his face. "We're learning about the Pilgrims in history. Next week is Thanksgiving." "That's right." She nodded, wondering where this was leading. "We don't really celebrate it," Jasper continued. "Dad always works. Aunt Delaney goes to Manhattan for some charity dinner." The thought of the child spending the holiday with only the staff for company tightened Meredith's chest. "What would you like to do for Thanksgiving if you could choose?" His eyes lit up briefly before dimming. "It doesn't matter. Dad says tradition. Taz just habit with better marketing." Meredith couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. That sounds like your father. Ms. Thorne. The voice from the doorway froze them both. Delaney Foster stood watching her expression disapproving. I believe the West Wing requires your attention. Jasper has study hall now. Jasper's shoulders slumped as he obediently moved toward the door. Yes, Aunt Delaney. As Meredith gathered her cleaning supplies, a wild, possibly career-ending idea took shape in her mind. Sometimes she reflected the most important rules were the ones worth breaking. The following Monday, Meredith arrived for work with an unusual determination. She timed her cleaning rotation perfectly, ensuring she would encounter Griffin during his brief lunch break. The one time Delaney typically spent at her Manhattan apartment managing her foundation calls. She found him in his study as expected, working through a sandwich while reviewing documents on his tablet. Mr. Hayes, she began without preamble, I need to speak with you about Jasper. Griffin looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before his expression closed off. Ms. Thorne, if this is about the weekend visits, it's about Thanksgiving. She interrupted, a boldness born of genuine concern, overriding her usual professional caution. Jasper mentioned you don't celebrate it. Griffin set down his tablet with deliberate care. Our holiday observances are hardly within your purview. With respect, sir, I disagree. Meredith stepped forward, placing her hands on his desk. That little boy needs traditions and celebrations and normal childhood experiences. He needs to know he matters more than work calls and prep school applications. A muscle ticked in Griffin's jaw. You're overstepping, Ms. Thorne. Someone needs to. She held his gaze steadily. Jasper is withering before our eyes, returning to that sad, silent child I met on my first day. Is that really what you want for him? What Celeste would have wanted? The mention of his late wife made Griffin's expression darken. Do not presume to invoke my wife's wishes. Then honor them yourself, Meredith challenged. The greenhouse she built for him sits unused. The joy she wanted for him is being systematically eliminated from his schedule. When was the last time you saw him truly laugh, Mr. Hayes? The question hung between them, unanswerable, because they both knew the truth. Not since the meteor shower night, not since Delaney's return and the subsequent restructuring of their lives. Griffin's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a weariness that aged him visibly. What would you have me do? Meredith throw a Thanksgiving? Feast when we have no family to invite. Pretend we're something we're not. The use of her first name, unconscious as it seemed, gave her hope. Create something new then, something that's yours. Not what's expected of Griffin Hayes, CEO, but what's needed by Griffin and Jasper Hayes, father and son. She watched the conflict play across his features. Duty versus desire. Tradition versus possibility. Finally, he looked up at her, something shifting in his glacial blue eyes. What did you have in mind? 3 days later, on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Jasper returned from his math tutor to find the formal dining room transformed. The massive table had been moved aside, replaced by a picnic blanket spread across the floor. Platters of holiday foods, turkey sandwiches cut into pilgrim hat shapes, mini pumpkin pies, apple cider in mason jars, created a feast unlike anything previously seen in the Hayes household. What's this? He asked, wide-eyed with confusion. Griffin stepped forward, uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a sweater. I believe it's called Thanksgiving giving. But Thanksgiving is Thursday, Jasper pointed out, ever precise like his father. True, Griffin acknowledged, but I thought we might start our own tradition, pre-Thanksgiving, for practice. We don't do traditions, Jasper said cautiously, as if fearing a test. Griffin knelt to his son's level, something he rarely did, and placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. Maybe it's time we started. From the doorway, Meredith and Dashiell appeared, the latter bouncing with barely contained excitement. Surprise, Dashiell exclaimed. We're your Thanksgiving guests. Mom made her famous cranberry sauce, which actually comes from a can, but she puts it on a fancy plate so it looks homemade. Jasper's face transformed with joy, so pure it seemed to illuminate the room. He looked questioningly at his father, seeking permission. Griffin nodded. I believe the traditional Thanksgiving activity is to state what we're thankful for before eating. Would you like to start, Jasper? As the unlikely group settled around the picnic blanket sharing simple food and genuine laughter, none of them noticed Delaney watching from the hallway, her expression calculating as she observed Griffin's hand briefly covering Meredith's when she passed him the cider. The pieces were moving on a chessboard only Delaney could see, a game she had no intention of losing. December descended upon Connecticut with unusual ferocity. The first winter storm arrived without warning, blanketing Greenwich in 8 inches of snow and ice that transformed the landscape into a treacherous wonderland. Schools closed, roads became impassable, and the Hayes estate, with its private generators and well-stocked pantries, became an island of warmth in the frigid countryside. The storm coincided with Delaney's week-long trip to London for her foundation's international gala. In her absence, a strange peace had settled over the household. Griffin had eased Jasper's rigorous schedule, allowing time for snowman building and hot chocolate breaks. Meredith had been quietly upgraded from cleaning duties to what Mrs. Whitfield begrudgingly termed household coordination, a vague title that allowed her to spend more time with Jasper without officially changing her employment status. If anyone noticed the softening in Griffin's demeanor when Meredith entered a room or the way her eyes followed him when he wasn't looking, they had the good sense not to comment. The household existed in a delicate equilibrium, a snow globe of possibility that everyone understood would be shaken upon Delaney's return. On the 4th day of the storm, Griffin found himself uncharacteristically lingering in the kitchen where Meredith was teaching Jasper how to make gingerbread cookies. Flour dusted the countertops, holiday music played softly from a speaker, and Jasper's laughter, still a precious rarity, filled the space with warmth that had nothing to do with the ovens. "Dad, look," Jasper held up a misshapen gingerbread man. "This one's you. See, I gave him a tiny computer." Griffin examined the cookie with exaggerated seriousness. "The resemblance is uncanny, though I'd like to think my head isn't quite that lopsided." Jasper giggled. "Ms. Thorne says homemade. Things are supposed to be imperfect. That's how you know they're made with love." Griffin's eyes met Meredith's over his son's head, something unspoken passing between them, acknowledgement of how far they had come, fear of how easily it could be lost. "Your Miss Thorne is very wise," he said softly. "A fact you seem to forget rather quickly, Griffin." The cold voice from the doorway shattered the moment, like ice cracking on a frozen pond. Delaney stood framed in the entrance, still in her travel clothes, snow melting from her designer boots onto the imported tile. Her expression as she surveyed the domestic scene before her could only be described as predatory. "Delaney." Griffin straightened instinctively, moving slightly in front of Meredith. "We weren't expecting you until Friday." Clearly. Her gaze swept over the flower-covered counters, the holiday decorations, the comfortable familiarity between the 3 of them. "I caught an earlier flight when I heard about the storm. The foundation gala was cancelled due to the terrorism threat in London." "Terrorism," Meredith echoed, automatically moving closer to Jasper. Nothing came of it, thankfully. Delaney dismissed, though her expression suggested she might have preferred a different outcome to justify her dramatic entrance. "Jasper, darling, why don't you go wash up? You're covered in ingredients." Jasper looked uncertainly between the adults, sensing the tension. "But we haven't finished the cookies." "I'm sure Miss Thorne can manage without you," Delaney insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Besides, I've brought you something special from Harrods." With a resigned nod, Jasper slipped from the kitchen, shooting an apologetic glance at Meredith as he left. Once he was out of earshot, Delaney's polite veneer evaporated. "Well, isn't this cozy playing house while the cat's away?" "That's enough, Delaney," Griffin warned, his voice low. Meredith began gathering her baking supplies. "I should go, the roads are clearing and—" "Oh, don't leave on my account," Delaney said with venomous sweetness. "After all, you've made yourself quite at home in my absence, upgrading from cleaner." "What exactly should we call your position now, Griffin?" Griffin's jaw tightened. "Ms. Thorne has been invaluable during the storm. Her presence has been good for Jasper." "I'm sure it has," Delaney agreed with false sincerity, almost as if she's been auditioning for a more permanent role. She turned her attention directly to Meredith. "Tell me, Miss Thorne, do all your employers fall so easily under your spell, or is Griffin special?" Meredith's cheeks flushed with anger. "I've done nothing inappropriate. I care about Jasper's well-being, that's all." "Just Jasper's." Delaney raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "How selfless of you. And does caring for Jasper's well-being include encouraging Griffin to abandon the educational structure that will secure his future, or perhaps distracting him from his responsibilities to Celeste's memory? Celeste would have wanted her son to be happy." Meredith shot back before she could stop herself. The room went deathly quiet. "How dare you?" Delaney whispered, her voice trembling with genuine rage. "How dare you presume to know what my cousin would have wanted for her child?" She turned to Griffin. "Are you going to allow this servant to invoke Celeste's name, to undermine everything we've worked for with Jasper?" Griffin stood frozen between the two women, torn between the comfortable world Delaney represented, predictable, respectable, aligned with his late wife's family, and the new possibilities Meredith had introduced into their lives. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should all take a moment to calm down." "I'm perfectly calm," Delaney insisted, though her white-knuckled grip on her purse suggested otherwise. "I'm simply pointing out that your judgment has been compromised. This woman has clearly manipulated her way into your household for her own advantage." "That's not true," Meredith protested, tears of frustration building behind her eyes. No, Delaney's smile was razor-sharp. "Then you won't mind stepping back into your proper role. The East Wing bathrooms haven't been properly cleaned in days, I noticed." Meredith looked to Griffin, waiting for him to defend her, to acknowledge what had grown between them. But his expression had closed off, retreating behind the impenetrable mask of the businessman she had first met. "Perhaps it would be best if you took a few days off, Ms. Thorne," he said finally, not meeting her eyes, "until things settle." The dismissal struck Meredith like a physical blow. All the moments they had shared, the stargazing, the Thanksgiving celebration, the quiet conversations by the fire, seemed to evaporate in an instant, deemed worthless against the power of tradition and social expectation. "I see." She removed her apron with trembling hands. "Then I'll gather my things." As she left the kitchen, she heard Delaney's satisfied murmur, "It's for the best, Griffin. She was never going to fit into our world." The worst part was that Griffin didn't contradict her. Later that evening, as Meredith prepared to leave through the service entrance, a small figure darted out from behind a pillar. "You're going away?" Jasper accused, his eyes reed-rimmed from crying. "Just like everyone does." Meredith knelt before him, her own heart breaking. "Just for a little while, Jasper. Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out. It's because of Aunt Delaney, isn't it? She doesn't like when people are happy." His perception was startling, too mature for his 7 years. "It's complicated." "Sweetheart?" Meredith struggled to find words that wouldn't place him in the middle of adult conflicts. "But I want you to know that meeting you has been the best part of this job. You are an extraordinary boy, Jasper Hayes. Will you come back?" His voice cracked on the question. Meredith hesitated, unwilling to make promises she couldn't keep. "I hope so." "Dashiell is my best friend," Jasper whispered, "and you're my favorite grown-up. Even more than Dad sometimes, because you listen to me." Meredith pulled him into a gentle hug, memorizing the feel of his small frame against her heart. "Your dad loves you very much, Jasper. Sometimes adults just forget how to show it." As she drove away from the mansion, snow beginning to fall once more, Meredith couldn't stop the tears that blurred her vision. She had known from the beginning that she didn't belong in Griffin Hayes's world. The mistake had been allowing herself to hope even briefly that worlds could merge. The days following Meredith's departure stretched into a week of tense silence in the Hayes mansion. Griffin buried himself in work, scheduling back-to-back video conferences that kept him locked in his office from dawn until well past Jasper's bedtime. Delaney filled the void with increased educational activities for Jasper, transforming the brief holiday respite into an academic boot camp. Jasper, however, had changed. The spark of spirit that Meredith had kindled refused to be extinguished. He began to push back, subtly at first, then with increasing determination. He forgot his French vocabulary. He claimed stomach aches before piano lessons. He answered his father's distracted inquiries about his day with monosyllabic responses that mirrored Griffin's own communication style. 10 days after Meredith's dismissal, A second winter storm descended upon Connecticut, this one fiercer than the first. Schools closed indefinitely. The governor declared a state of emergency. Even Griffin's workaholic tendencies were curtailed when internet service became spotty across the region. Trapped in the mansion with no electronic distractions, Griffin found himself confronted with the consequences of his decision. Jasper's silent rebellion, Mrs. Whitfield's barely concealed disapproval, his own growing awareness of Meredith's absence, like a phantom limb still sensed, though no longer present. On the second evening of the storm, Griffin ventured into the kitchen for coffee and found Mrs. Whitfield preparing a tray. "Is that for Jasper?" he asked, noting the hot chocolate and cookies, attempts to recreate Meredith's recipes that somehow fell short. "Yes, sir," Mrs. Whitfield replied with uncharacteristic coldness. "He's refused dinner again." Griffin frowned. "Is he ill?" "Not physically." The housekeeper's normally neutral expression flickered with something like disappointment. "If you'll—" "Excuse me, sir. I'll take it," Griffin said impulsively, reaching for the tray. "Where is he?" "The greenhouse, sir. He goes there every afternoon now." Griffin's surprise must have shown on his face. "Yes," Mrs. Whitfield confirmed. "The East Wing greenhouse. Ms. Thorne apparently showed him how to care for the plants. He's been tending them quite diligently since her departure." The subtle emphasis on the final word carried volumes of unspoken criticism. Griffin found himself unable to meet the older woman's gaze. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. That will be all." Balancing the tray carefully, Griffin made his way to the greenhouse, the space Celeste had designed to teach their son about growth and nurturing. He hadn't entered it in years, finding the memories too painful after her death. Through the glass walls he could see Jasper's small form moving among the plants, carefully measuring water into a tin can, before distributing it to various pots. The boy moved with purpose and concentration, so absorbed in his task that he didn't notice his father's entrance. "Room service," Griffin announced softly. Jasper looked up, surprise flashing across his features before his expression closed off, a miniature version of Griffin's own emotional walls. "I'm not hungry." Griffin set the tray on a potting bench. "Mrs. Whitfield made your favorite cookies." "They're not the same," Jasper said, simply returning to his watering. Griffin surveyed the greenhouse with new eyes. What had once been a dusty, abandoned memorial to Celeste had been transformed. Plants thrived in neat rows. Hand-labeled markers identified each species. A child-sized watering can and gardening tools stood in a tidy arrangement. "You've been taking care of this place," he observed. Jasper nodded without looking up. "Someone has to." The simple statement carried an accusation that Griffin couldn't deny. He had abandoned this piece of Celeste just as he had emotionally abandoned their son. "Ms. Thorne showed you how?" he asked carefully. "She said that growing things teaches patience and hope." Jasper's voice caught slightly. "She helped me find Mom's gardening journals. They were in the library all along." Griffin felt something crack inside his chest. "I didn't know you were looking for them." "You never asked." Jasper finally looked up, his eyes, so like Celeste's, filled with a hurt too profound for his years. "You never ask about anything that matters." The truth of the statement staggered Griffin. How long had he been going through the motions of fatherhood without actually seeing his child? "I'm asking now," he said quietly, sitting on a stone bench beside a flowering jasmine plant, Celeste's favorite. "Tell me what matters to you, Jasper." The boy studied him suspiciously, as if searching for the catch. When Griffin remained silent, waiting, something in Jasper's rigid posture softened fractionally. "I miss Miss Thorne and Dashiell," he admitted. "They made me feel like being me was okay. And you don't feel that way with me." The question hurt to ask, but Griffin needed to hear the answer. Jasper shrugged, returning to his watering. "You want me to be like you, or like the kids at Whitmore Academy. Aunt Delaney wants me to be like Mom, but not really. Just the parts she approved of." The insight was startling from a 7-year-old. Had Griffin been so transparent in his disappointment? Had he made his own son feel inadequate simply for being himself? "I'm sorry." Griffin said the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "I've been lost since your mother died. That's not an excuse, just the truth. Jasper set down his watering can. Ms. Thorne says everyone gets lost sometimes. The brave ones admit it and ask for directions. A reluctant smile tugged at Griffin's mouth. She's a wise woman. Then why did you make her leave? The direct question held all the uncompromising clarity of childhood. Griffin struggled to formulate an answer that wouldn't either lie to his son or burden him with adult complexities. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes because they're afraid, he said finally. I was afraid of how things were changing. But change isn't always bad, Jasper countered, echoing words that had clearly come from Meredith. These plants change every day. Mom's journals say that's how they grow. Griffin looked around at the flourishing greenhouse, at his son's careful cultivation of Celeste's legacy, and felt the full weight of his failure. He had tried to freeze time after Celeste's death to preserve a mausoleum rather than nurture growth. In doing so, he had nearly suffocated the most precious gift she had left him, their son's spirit. You're right, he acknowledged. Change isn't always bad, and I think it's time for some changes around here. A tiny spark of hope flickered in Jasper's eyes. Like what? Before Griffin could answer, a frantic knocking interrupted them. Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the greenhouse door, her normally composed features tight with alarm. Mr. Hayes, come quickly, it's Miss Foster. Griffin followed her to the main house, Jasper trailing behind. They found Delaney in the foyer, agitated and still in her outdoor clothes. Griffin, thank goodness, we have an emergency. She gripped her, his arm voice pitched with genuine panic. I just drove past the Mason property. There's a child outside in this storm, just wandering along the road. I tried to stop, but the car slid in the ice. By the time I regained control, I'd lost sight of him. A child. Griffin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Are you certain? Small dark hair, blue jacket, Delaney confirmed. I called emergency services, but with the roads as they are. A small gasp from behind them made both adults turn. Jasper stood frozen, his face drained of color. Dashiell has a blue jacket, he whispered. He wears it all the time. Griffin knelt before his son. Jasper, why would Dashiell be out in the storm? Tears welled in the boy's eyes. He said in his letter that he missed me, that he was going to find a way to visit no matter what. Letter? What letter? Griffin demanded, his voice sharper than intended. Aunt Delaney's driver brought it yesterday, Jasper admitted. I was going to tell you, but you've been too busy avoiding your son, Mrs. Whitfield finished her, loyalty to Jasper overriding her usual deference. Griffin felt the blood drain from his face. If Dashiell had tried to walk to the estate in this weather, he turned to Mrs. Whitfield, call Miss Thorne immediately, find out if Dashiell is missing. As the housekeeper hurried to obey, Delaney gripped Griffin's arm. You can't go out in this storm, it's suicide, wait for emergency services. A child might be dying out there, Griffin retorted, already reaching for his coat and boots. Call everyone on staff, we need a search party. I'm coming too, Jasper insisted, his small face set with determination. I know where Dashiell would go. He said the willow tree by the pond was our special meeting place. Griffin hesitated only briefly before nodding. Stay with me at all times. He turned to Delaney. Keep trying emergency services. And when you reach Miss Thorne, tell her. We'll find her son. As they prepared to venture into the howling storm, Mrs. Whitfield returned, her expression grave. Sir, I've reached Miss Thorne. Dashiell is indeed missing. He slipped out while his grandmother was napping. Miss Thorne is already searching for him. Griffin felt his heart constrict with fear, not just for Dashiell but for Meredith alone in this deadly weather. Tell the security team to start at the main road and work inward. Jasper and I will check the pond. As father and son stepped into the blinding snow, Griffin gripped Jasper's hand tightly. We'll find them, he promised, praying it wasn't a lie. We'll bring them both home. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape of the Hayes estate into an alien terrain. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature continued to plummet as darkness fell. Griffin clutched Jasper's hand as they followed. The stone path toward the pond, each step treacherous on the ice-slicked surface. Stay close, Griffin shouted over the howling wind, drawing Jasper against his side. He had wrapped his son in layers of protective gear, thermal underwear, wool sweaters. his own oversized parka, but still feared the cold would penetrate. They had reached the halfway point to the pond when Griffin's phone vibrated in his pocket. The connection was spotty, but Mrs. Whitfield's voice broke through in fragments. "Police can't. Roads closed. Ms. Thorne is... Mrs. Whitfield." "You're breaking up," Griffin shouted into the phone. "Did they find Dashiell?" "No sign. Miss Thorne is in the park. Municipal Gardens." The connection died. Griffin stared at the useless device, his mind racing. The Municipal Gardens were on the opposite side of their property, bordering the public park. If Meredith believed Dashiell had headed there... "Dad!" Jasper tugged frantically at his sleeve, pointing toward a copse of trees. "I saw something blue." Griffin squinted through the swirling snow. For an instant he caught a flash of color, too structured to be natural, too small to be an adult. "Good eyes, Jasper. Stay behind me." They pushed forward, fighting against wind that seemed determined to drive them back. As they approached the trees, Griffin's heart lurched painfully in his chest. A small figure in a blue jacket lay huddled at the base of an ancient oak, partially covered by drifting snow. Dashiell! Jasper broke free from his grip, running ahead. Griffin reached them in 3 long strides, falling to his knees beside the motionless child. With trembling hands, he brushed snow from Dashiell's face. The boy's skin was alarmingly pale, his lips tinged blue. "Dashiell, can you hear me?" Griffin patted the child's cheek gently, then more firmly. "Dashiell!" The boy's eyelids fluttered, a soft moan escaping his lips. "Cold." Relief flooded Griffin, though he knew they weren't out of danger. Hypothermia had clearly set in, and the boy's left ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, a sprain or possibly a break that explained why he hadn't made it to the house. "I'm going to pick you up," Griffin explained carefully, lifting the child. "Jasper, stay right beside me. We need to get back to the house immediately." "But what about Miss Thorne?" Jasper asked, his eyes wide with worry. "She's out here somewhere." Griffin hesitated, torn between the immediate need to get Dashiell to safety and the knowledge that Meredith was still searching, perhaps growing equally hypothermic in the punishing cold. "We'll find her," he promised, "but first we need to get Dashiell warm." They had made it halfway back to the mansion when headlights cut through the snow. Griffin's Range Rover approaching slowly, on the service road chains on its tires, providing minimal traction on the ice. The driver's window lowered, revealing Mrs. Whitfield's worried face. "Mr. Hayes. Thank heavens." "Is the boy alive but hypothermic?" Griffin confirmed, carefully passing Dashiell through the rear door that Delaney had opened from inside. "His ankle's injured. He needs immediate medical attention. The roads to the hospital are impassable." Delaney informed him, helping settle Dashiell onto the heated leather seat. "But Dr. Winters is on his way. He lives just 2 miles down in the Olmsted development." Griffin nodded gratefully, surprised by Delaney's efficiency in a crisis. "Jasper, get in. Mrs. Whitfield will take you both back to the house." "What about you?" Jasper asked, though he was already climbing in beside Dashiell, instinctively taking the other boy's cold hand in his own. "I'm going to find Ms. Thorne." Griffin's voice left no room for argument. "Mrs. Whitfield tells security to illuminate the south grounds. Use the emergency floodlights." "Griffin, this is madness," Delaney protested. "The temperature is dropping by the minute. Let the professionals handle it when they can get through." "By then it could be too late," Griffin said, already moving away from the vehicle. "Go get the boys warm, I'll be fine." As the Range Rover carefully reversed, Griffin adjusted his headlamp and turned toward the Municipal Gardens. If Meredith had been searching there when Mrs. Whitfield called, she couldn't have gone far in these conditions. The wind seemed to strengthen with every step, driving ice crystals against his exposed skin like tiny needles. Griffin pulled his scarf higher, fighting the grim statistics cycling through his mind. Exposure in these temperatures could be fatal within hours. If Meredith had fallen, if she was already suffering from hypothermia. He refused to complete the thought. The security floodlights activated behind him, casting long shadows across the snow. Their glow provided just enough visibility for Griffin to make out the stone wall separating his property from the public gardens. "Meredith," he called, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Meredith." Only the storm answered, howling through the trees with growing fury. Griffin pushed forward, scaling the wall and dropping heavily into a snowdrift on the other side. The municipal gardens, beautiful in spring with their sculpted hedges and flower displays, had become a maze of snow-laden shapes, disorienting in their uniformity. Meredith, he tried again, sweeping his headlamp in wide arcs across the whiteness. A sound so faint he might have imagined it made him pause. Griffin held his breath, straining to hear over the wind. There it was again, a muffled call somewhere. To his left. Griffin turned his headlamp, cutting through swirling snow, to reveal a figure struggling through a drift, moving with the determined persistence of someone running on pure willpower. Meredith. He ran toward her, heart hammering against his ribs. She looked up at his voice, her face barely visible beneath layers of scarves and her snow-covered hood. For a moment she seemed to think him a hallucination. Griffin. Her voice was weak, her lips cracked from cold. I'm here. He reached her side, pulling her against him instinctively. I've got you. Dashiell, she managed through chattering teeth. My son. We found him, Griffin assured her, supporting her weight as her knees buckled. He's safe at the house. But you're freezing. How long have you been out here? Hours, she mumbled her words, slurring in a way that alarmed him. Knew he'd try. Reach Jasper, said my fault. Shh, save your strength. Griffin lifted her into his arms, her body frighteningly light and trembling violently. I'm taking you home. Not your employee anymore, she protested weakly, though her head dropped against his shoulder. No. Griffin agreed, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't suppress. You're much more than that. You always were. The journey back to the mansion seemed endless, each step a battle against the strengthening storm. Griffin's muscles screamed with effort, but he refused to falter, not with Meredith's life literally in his hands. He could feel her breaths growing shallower, her trembling less pronounced, both dangerous signs of advancing hypothermia. Stay with me, he urged when her eyes drifted closed. Tell me about Dashiell. Tell me about your first apartment. Anything. Just keep talking. Her eyes fluttered open. Why did you let me go? The question cut deeper than the winter wind. Fear, Griffin admitted, adjusting his grip to hold her closer. Fear of change, fear of feeling, fear of losing someone again. He pushed forward through a particularly deep drift. I was a coward, Meredith. A faint smile touched her blue-tinged lips. Griffin Hayes, afraid impossible. Terrified, he corrected, relief flooding him as the mansion's lights appeared through the snow. Especially of how much I need you, how much Jasper needs you. Her eyes closed again, her body going limp in his arms. Griffin felt panic surge through his veins, giving him a final burst of strength as he staggered the last 100 yards to the house. The front door burst open as he approached. Staff members rushed forward, helping him bring Meredith inside to the waiting doctor, who had already treated Dashiell. Moderate to severe hypothermia. Dr. Winters diagnosed, quickly directing them to lay Meredith on the sofa nearest the roaring fire. We need to warm her gradually. Remove the wet clothes, wrap her in heated blankets. Griffin stood back, allowing the doctor and Mrs. Whitfield to work. His gaze drifted to the adjacent sofa, where Dashiell lay wrapped in blankets, his color improved, though his expression remained pained. Jasper sat beside him, holding his friend's hand with fierce protectiveness. Who found her? Delaney's voice startled Griffin. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I wasn't sure you would in time. Neither was I. Griffin admitted, his usual composure shattered by the night's events. Delaney studied him for a long moment. You love her. It wasn't a question, but Griffin answered anyway. Yes. And the boy? Griffin's gaze returned to the two children, their hands still clasped despite their exhaustion. He's part of her, and now part of us. Delaney nodded slowly, something like resignation settling over her features. Celeste always said you were loyal to a fault. I just never expected to be on the losing end of that loyalty. Before Griffin could respond, Dr. Winters approached. Mr. Hayes, both patients are stabilized, but the boy's ankle is broken. He needs proper medical facilities, and Ms. Thorne should be monitored overnight for complications. "The roads," Griffin began. "Are clearing," Delaney interrupted. "I just received word from emergency services. The plows have reached Greenwich Centre. If we leave now, we can make it to New Haven Hospital." Griffin looked at her in surprise. Yes, well," Delaney straightened her shoulders. "Someone needs to make sure you don't muck up the insurance paperwork. Besides," she added, with a trace of her usual sharpness, "you'll need someone to drive your car back while you inevitably insist on staying at the hospital." For the first time, Griffin saw beyond Delaney's controlling exterior to the complicated truth beneath. She did care in her own way. Perhaps not as selflessly as he had needed, but genuinely nonetheless. "Thank you," he said simply. As they prepared for the journey, Griffin knelt beside Jasper. "I need to take Ms. Thorne and Dashiell to the hospital. I'll be back as soon as—" "I'm coming too," Jasper interrupted, his expression remarkably like Griffin's when facing down board members. "They're our family now, we stay together." Griffin felt something shift inside him, the final wall crumbling. He pulled his son into a fierce embrace. "Yes," he agreed. "We stay together. All of us." The pediatric wing of Yale New Haven Hospital hummed with quiet efficiency as Griffin paced the polished corridor. 3 days had passed since the storm. Dashiell's ankle had been set, and his body temperature normalized under the careful monitoring of medical staff. Meredith had recovered more slowly, her longer exposure to the elements, resulting in mild frostbite on her fingers and lingering respiratory issues that concerned the doctors. Griffin had barely left the hospital, catching brief naps in uncomfortable waiting room chairs, his normally immaculate appearance giving way to stubbled cheeks and rumpled clothes. Jasper remained equally steadfast, dividing his time between Dashiell's room and Meredith's, his solemn presence a testament to the new bonds that had formed. Delaney had surprised everyone by managing the practical matters with surprising grace, arranging for Meredith's mother to be transported to the hospital despite the still hazardous roads, ensuring Griffin's business obligations were temporarily delegated, even bringing fresh clothes for Jasper and toys for Dashiell. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Griffin stood at the window of Meredith's room watching snow melt from the hospital roof in the weak winter sunshine. Behind him, Meredith slept peacefully, her breathing finally, even her color restored. A soft knock drew his attention to the door where Dr. Abramowitz stood with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Hayes, a moment." Griffin stepped into the hallway, bracing himself for more medical information. "Is there a problem?" "Not with Ms. Thorne," the doctor assured him. "Her latest tests show significant improvement. She'll be discharged tomorrow. If this trend continues—" Relief loosened the knot that had resided in Griffin's chest since the storm. "That's excellent news." "Indeed." The doctor hesitated, seemingly gathering his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes, I've been caring for your family for many years. I delivered Jasper. I treated you for insomnia after Celeste's passing." Griffin nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "In all that time," the doctor continued carefully, "I've never seen Jasper as emotionally present as he's been these past few days. His concern for Ms. Thorne and her son shows an empathetic connection that frankly I had begun to worry he might never develop given the structured nature of his upbringing." The gentle criticism was delivered with such clinical detachment that Griffin might have missed it if he hadn't already begun questioning his parenting approaches. "Are you suggesting that nearly freezing to death was good for my son's emotional development, Doctor?" Griffin asked dryly. Dr. Abramowitz's lips twitched. "Not the crisis itself, no, but the family unit that has formed in response, unequivocally, yes." He glanced down the hall where Jasper could be seen reading to Dashiell both. Boys squeezed into the hospital bed, despite nurses' half-hearted objections. "Children need more than educational excellence and material security, Mr. Hayes. They need connection, belonging, love that is demonstrated, not just assumed." Griffin followed his gaze, witnessing the animated expression on his son's face as he acted out a story for his friend. When had Jasper last shown such uninhibited joy in his presence? "I've made mistakes," Griffin admitted quietly. "Parenthood is nothing but mistakes interrupted by occasional moments of clarity," the doctor replied with unexpected warmth. "The question is whether we learn from them." As the doctor departed, Griffin remained in the hallway absorbing the scene before him. Jasper and Dashiell already referring to themselves as brothers. Eleanor Thorne, Meredith's mother, knitting in the corner while supervising the boys. Even Mrs. Whitfield, who had arrived with fresh baked goods despite hospital regulations against outside food. They had become a peculiar makeshift family unit, drawn together by crisis, held together by something stronger than blood or social convention. "They're quite remarkable together, aren't they?" Delaney's voice startled him. She stood a few feet, away elegant as always, despite the hospital setting, watching the same scene with complex emotions playing across her features. "Yes," Griffin agreed cautiously, still uncertain where they stood after her unexpected support during the crisis. Delaney smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "I've been offered the directorship of the London branch of my foundation." Griffin turned to face her fully. "That's a significant opportunity. It would mean relocating, permanently." She met his gaze directly. "I'm going to accept it." The announcement hung between them. Not quite an apology, not quite a concession, but a recognition of changing dynamics nonetheless. "Celeste would be proud of your work," Griffin said, offering the affirmation he sensed she needed. Delaney's expression softened fractionally. "She would be proud of how you finally opened your heart again." She glanced toward Meredith's room. "She never wanted you to build a shrine to her memory, Griffin. She wanted you to build a life." Before he could respond, a nurse emerged from Meredith's room. "Mr. Hayes, she's asking for you." Griffin found Meredith sitting up in bed, her hair freshly brushed, her face animated despite lingering fatigue. "The doctor says I can go home tomorrow," she announced as he entered. "That's wonderful news." Griffin took the chair beside her bed, suddenly uncertain how to bridge the gap between them. Professional boundaries long since shattered, personal ones still undefined. Meredith saved him the trouble. "Griffin, we need to talk about what happens next. When I leave here, when we return to normal life." She twisted the edge of her blanket nervously. "The boys have become inseparable. Dashiell talks about Jasper constantly, and She hesitated, gathering courage. "I've grown to care deeply for both of you, but I can't go back to being just your employee, not after everything that's happened." Griffin reached for her hand, careful of the bandages protecting her healing fingertips. "I don't want that either." "What do you want?" she asked directly, her gaze steady despite her vulnerability. "Everything." Griffin admitted the word encompassing, all he had denied himself for years. A real home, not just a house, a partner, not just a co-parent for Jasper, a family built on love rather than obligation. He squeezed her hand gently. "I want you, Meredith, you and Dashiell, if you'll have us." Tears welled in Meredith's eyes. "Are you sure our worlds are so different? The social gap means nothing," Griffin interrupted firmly. "I've lived by other people's rules and expectations my entire life. It cost me years with my son. It nearly cost me the chance to love again." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I won't sacrifice another moment of happiness to maintain artificial boundaries." A smile bloomed across Meredith's face, transforming her exhaustion into radiance. "Well, when you put it that way, Mr. Hayes." Griffin's phone vibrated in his pocket, a text message from Jasper that simply read, "Did you ask her yet? Dashiell and I are waiting." With a laugh, Griffin showed Meredith the screen. "It seems our sons have been plotting." "Our sons," Meredith repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Griffin agreed, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "So do I." Spring arrived in Connecticut with determined vibrancy, as if compensating for winter's harsh grip. The Hayes estate grounds had transformed under Meredith's influence, with wildflower meadows, replacing some of the manicured lawns, treehouse construction underway, in the ancient oak and children's laughter, a regular soundscape. 3 months had passed since the storm that had nearly claimed 2 lives, but had instead saved an entire family. Meredith and Dashiell had moved into the mansion's guest wing while maintaining their apartment in New Haven, a compromise that allowed them to gradually adjust to their new reality while preserving some independence. The transition hadn't been without challenges. The social circles of Greenwich had buzzed with gossip about Griffin Hayes's unconventional household. Country club members exchanged meaningful glances when Meredith appeared at events, her working-class background as visible to them as if it had been embroidered on her clothes. Dashiell had struggled initially with the private school environment, his energetic nature chafing against rigid structures that Jasper had long since learned to navigate. Yet for every obstacle, there had been growth. Griffin had surprised everyone, including himself, by caring less about external judgment than he ever imagined possible. Meredith had found unexpected allies among some of the less conventional Greenwich mothers. The boys had become inseparable, each strengthening the other's natural qualities. Dashiell drawing Jasper out of his shell, Jasper providing Dashiell with focus and structure. On a perfect May afternoon, Griffin stood in his home office concluding a video call with investors. Through the window he could see Meredith in the garden, with Eleanor, the two women planting something with animated discussion. The sight still occasionally struck him as surreal, this warm, vibrant energy now integrated into his previously sterile existence. A notification on his calendar pulled his attention back to the screen. Celeste's birthday, greenhouse opening. Griffin felt the familiar pang that accompanied thoughts of his late wife, though the sharp edges of grief had softened over time. Today would have been her 38th birthday. In years past, he had marked the occasion with silent reflection in his study, perhaps a solitary glass of her favorite wine after Jasper was asleep. This year Meredith had suggested something different, a formal opening of the restored greenhouse as a living memorial. For months she and the boys had been secretly working to bring Celeste's botanical sanctuary back to life, following the detailed notes in her journals. Today, they would show Griffin the completed project. A soft knock at... The door interrupted his thoughts. Jasper stood in the doorway, uncharacteristically dressed in a button-down shirt and tie. "It's time, Dad," he announced solemnly. "We're ready for you in the greenhouse." Griffin followed his son across the grounds to the east wing, struck by how much taller Jasper seemed suddenly, whether from physical growth or newfound confidence he couldn't tell. "Before we go in," Jasper stopped at the greenhouse door. "Dashiell and I made something for you to explain the project." He handed Griffin a carefully bound book with the Garden of Remembering written on the cover in childish script. "Thank you," Griffin said, touched by the solemnity with which his son presented the gift. "You should read it before we go inside," Jasper advised. "It was Ms. Thorne's idea. She says sometimes words help when feelings get too big." Griffin nodded, opening the handmade volume. Inside he found pages of drawings and text, alternating between Jasper's precise printing and Dashiell's more exuberant scrawl, "The Garden. Of Remembering is not a sad place. It is where we keep people we love even when they are gone. Mom designed this garden to teach me about life cycles. Ms. Thorne helped us make it real again." The simple statement caught in Griffin's throat. He turned the page to find pressed flowers, scientific labels and childish observations about growth patterns and seasonal changes. The final page held a photograph of Celeste that he had never seen before. She stood in this very greenhouse heavily pregnant, her hands cradling her swollen belly as sunlight streamed through the glass around her. "Where did you find this?" Griffin asked, his voice rough with emotion. "In Mom's journals," Jasper explained. "There was a whole envelope of pictures. Ms. Thorne found them when we were researching the plants Mom wanted to grow." Griffin closed the book, carefully, overwhelmed by the thoughtful gesture. "Thank you, Jasper. This means more than you know." Jasper's expression brightened. "Wait until you see inside Dashiell, and I planted everything exactly where Mom's diagram showed. And we added special lights that change colors when it gets dark, like stars inside the glass." The boy pushed open the door, revealing the transformed space. What had once been abandoned and dusty now burst with carefully organized plant life. Tropical specimens shared space with native Connecticut flora. A small water feature trickled soothingly in one corner. Botanical illustrations had been framed and mounted on the walls, Celeste's handwriting visible on the aging paper. Meredith and Dashiell waited inside, both dressed more formally than usual. Behind them stood Mrs. Whitfield and Eleanor, the latter dabbing discreetly at her eyes. "Welcome to the living laboratory," Meredith said softly, using the name Celeste had given the space in her journals. The boys wanted to honor their mother's vision. The casual use of their rather than Jasper's didn't escape Griffin's notice. In recent weeks, Dashiell had begun referring to Celeste as his Sky Mom, while Jasper had taken to introducing Meredith as his Bonus Mom, their childish terminology for the complex family they were building. "It's perfect," Griffin managed, taking in the details, labeled specimens the reading nook with children's books about plants, the small workstations clearly designed for young scientists. "This section is my favorite," Dashiell declared, pulling Griffin toward a circular arrangement of plants surrounding a sundial. "Ms. Celeste called it the clock garden. These flowers tell time. This one opens at exactly 9:17 every morning. And these are night blooming," Jasper added, indicating another section. "They only open when the sun goes down. Mom wrote that they remind us that beautiful things happen even in darkness." Griffin felt Meredith's presence beside him before. He saw her warmth a tangible comfort. "They've worked so hard," she murmured. "Both of them wanted to make this perfect for you." "For us," Griffin corrected, turning to face her fully. The sunlight streaming through the glass illuminated her features, highlighting the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "This isn't just about honoring the past. It's about building our future." Something in his tone made Meredith study him more closely. "Griffin, what are you thinking?" Instead of answering, Griffin turned to the small gathering. "Could we have a moment alone, please?" Mrs. Whitfield nodded briskly, herding the others toward the door. "Come along, boys, let's prepare the refreshments for the garden party." "But I want to see—" Dashiell's protest was cut short by Jasper's hand on his arm and a whispered exchange that made both boys grin knowingly as they left. When the door closed behind them, Griffin took Meredith's hands in his. "I had a different plan for this. A traditional dinner, perhaps the restaurant where we had our first actual date. But standing here in this place that bridges past and future, so perfectly." He shook his head, momentarily overwhelmed. "This feels right." "What does—" Meredith asked, though the sudden vulnerability in her expression suggested she already sensed what was coming. Griffin released her hands only long enough to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I found myself at a crossroads after Celeste died. I chose the path of isolation, believing it was safer than risking love again." He opened the box, revealing a ring with a central emerald surrounded by smaller diamonds. "You showed me a different way forward, one where joy and sorrow coexist, where vulnerability becomes strength." Meredith's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee on the greenhouse floor. "Meredith Thorne, will you marry me? Will you help me build a family that honors what was while embracing what can be?" Tears spilled down Meredith's cheeks as she nodded momentarily beyond words. "Yes," she finally managed. "Of course, yes." As Griffin slipped the ring onto her finger, cheers erupted from outside the greenhouse. They turned to see Jasper and Dashiell with their faces pressed against the glass, identical expressions of delight, visible even through the fogged panes. "I think we have approval," Griffin laughed, rising to pull Meredith into his arms. "Was there ever any doubt?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. "They've been planning this longer than we have." Griffin glanced around the greenhouse, at the legacy of one love and the flowering of another, at the seamless blend of past and present sophistication and simplicity. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Celeste always told me that the most beautiful gardens embrace unexpected combinations. She said harmony doesn't come from sameness, but from finding the perfect complements." Meredith smiled, understanding the metaphor. She was a wise woman. "Yes," Griffin agreed, brushing a tender kiss against Meredith's lips. "And she would have loved you." Outside, the boys had abandoned their observation post and could be heard racing across the lawn, no doubt spreading the news to Eleanor and Mrs. Whitfield. Their excited voices carried on the spring breeze, the soundtrack of a house that had finally truly become a home. The October afternoon painted the Hayes estate in shades of amber and gold, nature's version of a celebration. White chairs arranged in neat rows across the back lawn, fluttered with ribbons that matched the turning leaves. A simple wooden arch, woven with late-blooming flowers from Celeste's greenhouse, stood sentinel against the backdrop of majestic oak trees. Inside the mansion, controlled chaos reigned. as final preparations unfolded for the wedding that would officially unite two families already bound by love. Mrs. Whitfield directed staff with military precision, while Eleanor fussed over table arrangements, the two women having developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared devotion to the blended family. In the master suite, Griffin adjusted his tie for the third time, uncharacteristically nervous. Jasper stood beside him in a matching suit, critically examining his father's handiwork. "It's crooked again," the boy observed, reaching up to straighten it himself. "You're supposed to be good at this stuff." Griffin smiled, allowing his son's intervention. "Apparently not today." "That's because your hands are shaking," Jasper pointed out with clinical precision. "Ms. Thorne says that happens when emotions get too big for your body." "Ms. Thorne is very wise," Griffin agreed, marveling at his son's growth over the past year. The quiet, withdrawn child had blossomed into an observant, articulate boy who moved between worlds with increasing confidence, the structured environment of his prestigious school and the joyful chaos of their reconfigured family life. A knock at the door revealed Dashiell, his own tie askew, despite Eleanor's best efforts. "Grandma says it's almost time. Are you ready? Mom looks like a princess. But don't tell her I said that, because she said princesses are overrated and self-actualized women don't need rescuing." Griffin laughed, the sound coming easily now after months of practice. "That certainly sounds like your mother." "She's nervous too," Dashiell confided, bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement. "She keeps touching her hair and asking if rich people will think the ceremony is too simple." Something twisted in Griffin's chest, a reminder of the social boundaries they had navigated throughout their relationship. While most of Greenwich society had eventually accepted their unconventional union, subtle reminders of class distinction occasionally surfaced in careless comments or surprised expressions when Meredith revealed her background. "The ceremony is perfect," Griffin said firmly. "Just like the bride." Dashiell nodded in solemn agreement. "That's what I told her. Plus, I said anyone who doesn't like it can just leave and make room for the cake table." "Excellent problem-solving," Griffin commended, checking his watch. "Shall we head downstairs? I believe we have an important job to do." The boys exchanged meaningful glances before Jasper spoke. "Actually, Dad, we wanted to give you something first." Dashiell produced a small box from his pocket. "It's from both of us," he explained proudly. "We saved our allowance." Griffin accepted the box with appropriate gravity, recognizing the significance of this joint gift from his biological son and the boy who would soon officially become his stepson. Inside, he found a simple silver pocket watch, its cover engraved with intertwined trees, one large, one small. "It's a family tree," Jasper explained, his expression earnest. "See how they grow together, that's us." "We wanted you to have something special for today," Dashiell added. "Mom has her grandmother's necklace, so we thought you should have something too." Griffin swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. "It's perfect," he managed, closing his hand around the watch. "Thank you both." Jasper, ever perceptive, handed his father a handkerchief. "It's okay to cry, Dad. Ms. Thorne says tears just mean your heart is working properly." Griffin laughed softly as he dabbed at his eyes. "Once again, your soon-to-be official bonus mom is absolutely right." Downstairs, the small gathering of guests had assembled on the lawn. Griffin had initially proposed an intimate ceremony with just immediate family, but Meredith had surprised him by requesting a slightly larger celebration. "Our story deserves witnesses," she'd explained. "People who can testify to the fact that walls really can come down, that bridges can be built between different worlds." Now, as Griffin took his place beneath the flower-covered arch, he surveyed those witnesses, Mrs. Whitfield beaming with uncharacteristic emotion, Delaney, who had flown in from London, with genuine well-wishes, colleagues who had overcome their initial skepticism to embrace the relationship, neighbors who had gradually welcomed Meredith into their community, and Eleanor, who would officially become family but had long since claimed a place in their hearts. The string quartet began playing, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. The boys appeared first, walking side by side down the aisle, carrying a banner they had created together, "Two families become one." Their matching suits and solemn expressions gave way to barely suppressed grins as guests chuckled appreciatively at their theatrical seriousness. When Meredith appeared at the end of the aisle, Griffin felt time suspend. She wore a simple ivory gown that caught the autumn light, her hair adorned with small flowers from Celeste's greenhouse, a thoughtful tribute that Jasper had suggested. But it was her expression that captivated Griffin, a mixture of joy, certainty, and loving determination that mirrored everything he felt in his own heart. Eleanor escorted her daughter down the aisle, her working-class dignity matching the grace of any society matron. When they reached Griffin, Eleanor placed Meredith's hand in his, a traditional gesture that carried profound significance in their non-traditional union. "Friends and family," the officiant began, "we gather today not only to witness the union of Griffin and Meredith, but to celebrate the formation of a family built on intention rather than convention, on love rather than obligation." As the ceremony progressed, the boys remained close, occasionally whispering comments that made the adults smile. When the time came for vows, Griffin and Meredith had prepared traditional promises but added personal pledges to each other's children. Griffin knelt to Dashiell's height. "I promise to honor your spirit, to guide without constraining, and to love you as my own, while respecting the journey that brought you to us." Meredith turned to Jasper, taking his small hands in hers. "I promise to nurture the seeds your mother planted, to help you grow into the person you're meant to become, and to keep her memory alive in our home and hearts." There wasn't a dry eye among the guests as the boys responded with unplanned hugs. Dashiell's exuberant embrace nearly knocking Griffin off balance, Jasper's more reserved but equally heartfelt. When Griffin and Meredith were finally pronounced husband and wife, the autumn breeze scattered golden leaves around them like nature's own celebration. Their kiss was briefly interrupted by Dashiell's stage whisper, "Is it time for cake now?" causing ripples of laughter to break the solemnity of the moment. The reception unfolded on the lawn, white tables arranged beneath trees, strung with fairy lights that would illuminate as evening approached. Children from both Jasper's prestigious academy and Dashiell's former public school played together, their differences forgotten in the universal language of celebration and cake. As dusk fell, Griffin found a moment of quiet with his new wife, drawing her away from the festivities to the greenhouse that had become the heart of their blended home. "Happy?" he asked, though her radiant expression had already answered the question. "Beyond words," Meredith confirmed, leaning into his embrace. "Did you ever imagine when you interviewed that nervous cleaning lady in your study that we'd end up here?" Griffin smiled, remembering that first meeting, her straight posture despite her obvious anxiety, the gentle intelligence in her eyes that had registered even through his grief-induced emotional barriers. "I think part of me recognized you even then," he admitted. "Not consciously, perhaps, but something in me knew you were the missing piece." Meredith touched the emerald ring on her finger, now paired with a simple gold band. "Not a missing piece," she corrected gently. "I was never meant to complete you or replace what was lost. We were each whole people who chose to create something new together." Griffin nodded, appreciating her wisdom. "A family formed by choice rather than chance." "Exactly." She glanced through the greenhouse glass to where the boys were teaching smaller children how to launch paper airplanes from the terrace. "Though I think those two had it planned all along." "Masterminds," Griffin agreed with a laugh. "Jasper's strategy and Dashiell's execution. An unbeatable combination," Meredith said, her voice softening, "just like their parents." From across the lawn, Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the greenhouse entrance. "Forgive the interruption, but it's time for the first dance." As they returned to the reception, the sun had fully set, casting the estate in the golden glow of carefully placed lights. Guests formed a circle around the dance floor, a temporary wooden platform placed atop the lawn. The music began, not the classical waltz Griffin had initially suggested, but a contemporary love song that Meredith had preferred. As they moved together, Griffin realized how much he had changed, how much they had changed each other. The rigid businessman who measured success in acquisitions and social standing had learned to value spontaneity and emotional connection. The struggling single mother who had defined herself by her sacrifices had embraced her worth beyond her maternal role. "Look," Meredith whispered, nodding toward the edge of the dance floor. Jasper and Dashiell had positioned themselves directly opposite each other, solemnly mirroring Griffin and Meredith's dance steps with exaggerated formality that soon dissolved into boyish laughter. "Should we invite them to join us?" Griffin asked. Meredith's smile illuminated her face. "Absolutely." With a gesture from Griffin, the boys raced onto the dance floor, breaking the traditional first dance protocol, but creating a moment that perfectly symbolized their union, not just two individuals joining, but two families becoming one. As other guests gradually joined them, Griffin held his new family close, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment. The winter storm that had nearly claimed 2 lives, but had instead saved 4. The greenhouse that bridged past and present. The paper airplanes and midnight star watching and impromptu Thanksgiving celebrations that had gradually thawed his frozen heart. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Mrs. Whitfield approached with an uncharacteristically emotional expression. "I hope you'll forgive an old woman's sentimentality," she said, her usual formality softened by the occasion. "But I believe Celeste would be pleased to see the estate filled with life again, to see Jasper flourishing, to see you embracing happiness." Griffin nodded, appreciating the observation from someone who had known his first wife well. Celeste always said that true love expands rather than diminishes, that there's always room for more joy if we're brave enough to open the door. "A wise woman," Mrs. Whitfield agreed, "and I believe she would particularly approve of your choice." She glanced toward Meredith, who was laughing with Eleanor as they watched the children's impromptu dance competition. "Someone who values substance over status, who sees the person behind the position." As the evening progressed, Griffin found himself standing on the terrace, observing the celebration with a sense of profound gratitude. The mansion, once a cold monument to wealth and status, had transformed into a true home. The carefully maintained social barriers that had defined his existence had given way to authentic connections. Meredith joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Hayes." "I was just thinking about walls," he replied, pulling her closer. "How we build them, thinking they'll protect us, never realizing they're actually prisons." "And now?" she asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Griffin looked out at their gathered loved ones, the unexpected family they had created together. "Now, I understand that the only walls worth building are the ones with doors held open." The autumn breeze carried the scent of late-blooming flowers from Celeste's greenhouse, mingling with the music and laughter from their wedding reception. As darkness fell completely, stars appeared overhead. The same stars they had watched together on that pivotal night when barriers had first begun to crumble. In that moment, Griffin Hayes, once defined by wealth, position, and carefully maintained emotional distance, understood the true measure of abundance, not in possessions accumulated or appearances maintained, but in walls transformed into bridges, in winters that eventually yield to spring in hearts brave enough to begin again. "Ready to rejoin our guests?" Meredith asked, her eyes reflecting the fairy lights strung among the trees. Griffin kissed her softly, a promise of all the days to come, ready for everything. Hand in hand they returned to the celebration, to the family they had chosen, to the future they would build together. Not despite their differences, but because of them, not by erasing the past, but by honoring its lessons, not by chance, but by choice. And in that choice lay the most powerful truth of all, that love, when finally embraced without reservation, can transform the coldest mansion into the warmest of homes.